The Seraphim drifted through the endless void, its crew weary, but eager on their mission to explore new frontiers, to chart the stars, and make contact with unknown civilizations. But as the ship moved deeper into the uncharted system, the sensors picked up something strange, a faint signal crackling through the static, barely audible, but unmistakably human. The captain, Alina Ryder, stared at the console as the message cut through the silence of space, her mind racing. This wasn't supposed to be here. No human colonies were known in this sector. No human ships had passed through for decades. The signal was urgent and distorted, but there was no mistaking the desperation in it. "Captain, you need to hear this," Lieutenant Samantha Cole said as she stepped up beside her. "It's a distress call." The captain's fingers hovered over the console, unsure if they should respond. The signal was weak, and the source was unknown. But as the words became clearer, they carried a chilling message. "We need help." The voice was strained and broken. At what sounded like static, the transmission continued to sputter. "They're coming." And then it went silent just as quickly as it had begun. Ryder's heart skipped a beat. "Open a channel." She ordered the crew's attention, snapped to the captain as the quiet hum of the ship seemed to grow louder. "This is Captain Alina Ryder of the exploration vessel Seraphim. We're receiving your distress signal. Please respond." The silence that followed was unnerving. The crew exchanged nervous glances. Lieutenant Cole spoke first. "The signal is coming from the third planet in the system, but no colony was supposed to be there." The captain nodded, but her gaze was fixed on the dark expanse ahead. She could feel something was wrong. There was an edge to the air, now a tension that none of them could explain. "Set a course for the third planet," Ryder said, her voice firm, despite the unease creeping into her thoughts. She trusted her crew, she trusted her ship, and she would see this through, whatever it was. "We'll investigate." The ship's engines hummed to life, and the Seraphim began its journey into the unknown. As they approached the planet, the first thing they noticed was the silence. No signals, no communications from the surface, no signs of life. As the ship entered orbit, the sensors swept over the planet, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The landscape was barren, with jagged mountain ranges and vast deserts that stretched endlessly. But it wasn't the planet's surface that had the crew on edge. It was the eerie stillness, no movement, no activity, no trace of the people who had once called this place home. "We should land near the last known coordinates of the signal," Cole suggested, her voice tight with unease. "Prepare landing gear," Ryder replied, her mind already racing through the possibilities. The distress call had been real, but where was the colony? Where were the people? And what had happened to them? The Seraphim descended through the toxic atmosphere of the planet. The thick clouds obscured their view of the surface until the last moment when the ship broke through, and the desolation became visible from above. The planet looked dead. The cities of the colony were reduced to rubble, the landscape scorched as if a great fire had swept across the land. And still there was no sign of life, no movement, no sounds except the wind blowing across the barren land. "This doesn't feel right," Cole muttered as they touched down on the cracked earth below. The captain's instincts told her this was only the beginning. As the landing gear touched the cracked ground, a heavy silence settled over the crew. The atmosphere outside the Seraphim's hull was thick and toxic, but they had prepared for it with full protective suits and respirators. The air felt suffocating as they stepped onto the barren planet's surface. A cold wind whipped through the dead city surrounding them. The skeletal remains of buildings cast long shadows in the dim light. The once thriving colony now lay in ruin. "Keep your eyes open," Captain Ryder ordered, her voice steady, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it. The team moved quickly through the desolate streets, weapons drawn, scanning for any signs of life or movement. The city was eerily quiet, not a sound except for the creaking of metal and the groaning of structures weakened by time and neglect. They passed by abandoned structures once full of life, now reduced to ashes and twisted wreckage. It looked like something had torn through the city, like a storm of unimaginable force, sweeping everything away. And yet there was no indication of any battle or resistance, only utter devastation. "What happened here?" Cole asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was scanning the surroundings with a look of disbelief on her face. "Whatever it wasn't an accident," Ryder replied. The sense of dread grew with every step. They took further into the ghost town. The captain felt something gnawing at her gut. Something was off, but she couldn't quite place it. There were no signs of a struggle, no corpses, no blood, only emptiness. They continued moving through the deserted streets until they came to the central square where a tall monument stood in the middle. It was a simple structure, but it seemed to be the last remnant of the colony's pride. The stone was cracked and weathered, but it was still standing, though it looked like it had been through something far worse than time. "Over here," one of the crew members shouted from a nearby alleyway. The team rushed over to find the first signs of life they'd encountered since landing. A group of survivors, huddled together against the wall, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with fear. The team approached cautiously. "Are you all right?" Ryder called out softly, hoping to calm them. The survivors looked up, their eyes clouded with terror. They were shaken, broken, their clothes torn and dirty. The leader of the group, a man with graying hair and a hollow expression, stepped forward. He spoke in a low voice, as if afraid to make a sound. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. "They're still here." The words sent a shiver down Ryder's spine. She stepped closer. "Who's here? What happened to your people?" The man shook his head as if trying to block out the memories. "They came from the stars," he said, his voice trembling. "They're not like us. They're not like anyone." The crew exchanged confused looks, unsure of what he meant, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. The captain pressed further. "Tell me what happened." The survivor swallowed hard, his hands shaking. "We didn't know they were coming, not until it was too late. They came down on us without warning, massive ships filled with warriors. They killed everyone. They wiped us out like we were nothing." He trembled, his breath catching in his throat. They were human." The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. Humans attacking their own kind, but not just any humans. The survivors called them Deathworlders, a name that sounded as ominous as the threat they represented. Ryder felt a cold shiver run through her. She had heard whispers of such a group of humans living on a planet so dangerous that they had become a myth in galactic history, but hearing it now, in person, made her realize just how close the galaxy was to a war unlike any they had ever known. "We were just trying to survive," the survivor whispered, "but they are not here to talk." The survivor's words hung in the air like a dark omen. "They're not here to talk," echoed in Ryder's mind. As she scanned the faces of the crew around her, none of them seemed to fully grasp the enormity of what had just been revealed, but there was no time to process it fully. They had to act. The captain's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. She turned to the survivor, who was now sitting on the ground, clutching his knees, his face pale. "We need to know more. Tell us everything." The man swallowed hard and nodded before speaking in a barely audible voice. "We didn't know they were coming until they arrived. They came from the sky like fire falling from the heavens. We thought they were just another pirate raid at first, but then they opened fire on us as if we were nothing more than insects to crush beneath their feet. Their ships were massive, dark, and covered in weapons. We didn't stand a chance." Ryder looked over at Cole, who was visibly disturbed by the survivor's description. "How many ships?" Cole asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "I don't know," the survivor replied, shaking his head. "Too many. I couldn't count them all, but they were everywhere, surrounding the planet. When they landed, their warriors stormed our cities. We tried to fight back, but they were too strong, too fast, too ruthless. They tore through us like we were made of paper." He paused, his eyes glazed with memories too horrifying to fully comprehend. "And they were human," he whispered again, as if trying to convince himself. "They were human." The word struck Ryder like a thunderclap. She had heard of Deathworlders, humans from a planet so dangerous that it had driven them to evolve beyond what anyone thought was possible for their species. Stories of their ruthless survival and incredible strength had been whispered among the galaxy's most seasoned explorers, but she never imagined that they could be this dangerous, this deadly. "So what exactly are they?" Cole asked. "How did they become like this?" The survivor took a long, shuddering breath. Their home planet is a place no one dares to go. It's a death trap, a world so harsh that every day is a fight for survival. They're born into a war against the environment, against everything. They live among predators larger than anything we can imagine. The air itself will kill you if you're not careful. They are forged in violence and fear, but they survive, and they've adapted to it. He stopped, struggling to find the words. They're not like us. They don't see things the way we do. They only understand power and survival. Ryder turned this over in her mind. A species so shaped by their environment that their very culture and mindset were defined by a constant fight for life. It made sense in a twisted way, but it also meant they were a force unlike anything they had encountered before. "Why come here?" Cole asked. "Why wipe out your people like this?" The survivor looked at the ground, eyes haunted by memories too painful to recount. They didn't come here to conquer or take over. They came because they have nowhere else to go. Their planet is dying. They're refugees searching for a new home, for a new planet to survive on. His voice trembled as he spoke. They're desperate. They'll do anything to survive. The words hit Ryder hard. The Deathworlders weren't invaders for the sake of domination. They were refugees with no other option but to fight for a new home. She felt a pang of sympathy, but that sympathy didn't change the threat they posed to the galaxy if they couldn't be stopped. "How many are left?" Ryder asked. "Not many," the survivor replied. "Most are dead or taken, but some are hiding in the ruins. We've been trying to survive, but the Deathworlders won't stop until they find a new planet." The cold truth settled over the crew like a weight. They weren't just dealing with a military force. They were facing a species fighting for its very existence. As the survivors' words sank in, the gravity of the situation began to settle over the crew of the Seraphim. They weren't just dealing with rogue humans from a distant, hostile world. They were facing a fleet of refugees driven by desperation and an unyielding desire to survive. The captain, Alina Ritter, stood tall, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned. The Deathworlders weren't invaders in the traditional sense. They weren't seeking conquest or glory. They were fleeing extinction. "If they're refugees," Cole asked, "where are they going?" Her voice had a tone of disbelief, as if this couldn't possibly be real. How can a fleet that big just appear out of nowhere and not be detected before? Ryder's eyes scanned the horizon over the ruined colony, as if hoping for answers in the twisted skyline. "They're not here by chance," she muttered under her breath. "They've been planning this for months, maybe years, building up a fleet, scouring the galaxy for a new home." Her words were like a curse, her thoughts racing, and she could sense the immense challenge they now faced. And they're probably not done yet. The crew moved swiftly back to the Seraphim, where Lieutenant Cole had already begun scanning the system with renewed urgency. The colony was just one piece of the puzzle. If these Deathworlders were as organized as they seemed, there was no telling how many more worlds they had already attacked, or what resources they'd amassed. Their fleet was only one part of the equation. What came next was just as dangerous. "We're not the only ones who've detected them," Cole said sharply from her console. "The system's full of unusual activity. I'm getting reports of strange energy signatures beyond normal ship traffic near the outer rim. It looks like they've been gathering ships for weeks, maybe longer." Ryder felt a chill run through her. "How many ships are we talking about?" she asked, already fearing the answer. "At least 35 ships," Cole replied grimly. "Most of them are enormous. Some are in orbit above the planet right now, but there's also activity on their flagship. It's massive, larger than anything we've seen, and it looks like they've just made it operational for their fleet to launch." "The flagship," Ryder repeated, her mind sharp with the new understanding that this wasn't a random attack, but a full-scale operation. "That's what they've been building up to this whole time." Her fingers ran over the cold surface of the ship's control panel. "If they launch their fleet now, there's no telling how much damage they could do to the nearby systems, let alone the rest of the galaxy. We need to figure out their next move." Her voice was steady, but inside, the pressure was mounting. The pieces were falling into place, and the reality of what was coming struck her harder than anything else so far. The Deathworlders had a plan, and that plan involved more than just survival. It was about finding a new home at any cost, even if it meant annihilating entire civilizations to make room for themselves. "They must have a target," Cole said, Looking at the data, they wouldn't waste this kind of effort just to destroy worlds randomly. They're too calculated for that. They're not here to kill for the sake of killing. Ryder said, her voice resolute. They're here because they're running out of options. She turned to the crew, gathering them around. We need to find that flagship before they launch. If we can disable it, we might have a chance at stalling their entire fleet. The crew stood in silence, each member knowing the gravity of what was at stake. This wasn't just a mission of exploration anymore. This was a race against time, a mission to prevent an unstoppable force from setting sail and wiping out everything in their path. I'll prepare the team for a boarding operation. Cole said after a long pause. We'll need to move fast and get inside that flagship before it's too late. We leave immediately, Ryder said, her voice unshakable. And if we fail, the entire galaxy could burn. They weren't just fighting for survival now. They were fighting to give the Deathworlders a chance to live without destroying everything else in the process. The decision weighed heavily on Captain Alina Ryder's shoulders as she stood at the helm of the Seraphim, staring at the holographic projection of the Deathworlder fleet. Their ships were massive and dark, looming over the horizon of the planet like a storm cloud ready to unleash hell, and each second they delayed brought the galaxy one step closer to a war that could reshape everything. Ryder had faced tough choices before, but this one was unlike any she had ever encountered, and the consequences were unimaginable. We can't let them launch, Lieutenant Cole said, her voice sharp as she surveyed the data. If they take off, there's no telling how many systems they'll conquer before anyone even knows what's happening. Their fleet is too powerful for us to stop once it's in motion. Ryder nodded, but her mind wasn't so certain. The Deathworlders weren't just invaders. They were refugees, desperate and willing to sacrifice anything to ensure their survival. The more she learned about them, the more she understood their plight. But the galaxy wasn't prepared to handle such a drastic shift. A migration of this scale could destabilize entire civilizations. And what if they couldn't coexist? What if it all ended in bloodshed? We need to warn the other systems, Cole continued. Gather allies, prepare defenses, anything we can do to slow them down. There's no way we can stop them with just the crew of the Seraphim. And what if we can't convince anyone to help? Ryder asked the question that had been gnawing at her ever since they'd received the first distress signal. What if the galaxy sees them as a threat and wants to exterminate them before they even have a chance to explain themselves? The thought made her sick, but she couldn't deny the possibility. The universe had seen its share of conflicts, each more brutal than the last. How would the Council, the United Systems, even react to this? What would they do when faced with a fleet of humans who were unlike any species they had ever known? We can't let that happen, Cole said firmly. We need to do everything we can to show the galaxy that the Deathworlders are not just enemies to be destroyed. They're people, just like us. The weight of her words hung in the air. The crew knew the risks, knew how dangerous it would be to try to convince the galaxy to let the Deathworlders in, but they also knew the alternative could be catastrophic. Ryder clenched her fists, the cold reality sinking in. They couldn't afford to fail. They couldn't afford to ignore what the Deathworlders truly were. Survivors just like any other species, but with nothing left to lose. We can't afford to be divided, Ryder said, her voice steady as she turned to the crew. We either fight for their right to exist alongside us, or we fight to stop them from launching and let the galaxy tear itself apart in the process. But whatever we choose, we need to act fast, because we don't have much time. There was silence in the command room as the crew absorbed the weight of the decision they were about to make. Each person was acutely aware that no matter which choice they made, the ripple effects would echo throughout the galaxy forever. If we try to warn everyone and fail, Cole said, her voice quieter now, we might doom both sides. And if we don't try, we risk making them into enemies forever. It's a thin line. Ryder took a deep breath. She had known from the start that no mission would ever be more difficult than this one. But this was more than a choice between two outcomes. This was a choice about what kind of future the crew of the Seraphim wanted to build, a future where survival didn't mean the destruction of everything else. We need to make it clear to the Deathworlders that we're not their enemy," Ryder said, her voice firm. "But we also need to stop them before they destroy everything else we hold dear. We'll infiltrate their flagship, disable it, and buy time to convince the rest of the galaxy to hear them out before it's too late." The crew nodded, understanding the challenge ahead. "Let's make it happen," Cole said with determination. Ryder turned to face her crew, her gaze resolute. "This is a choice we make together. No matter what happens, we do it for the future. We want to see a future where we don't just survive, but where we live." The plan was set in time, was running out. The Deathworlder's flagship was within striking distance. The clock was ticking faster. With every passing second, the Seraphim's crew knew their mission wasn't just dangerous, it was practically impossible, but they didn't have a choice. If they didn't succeed in sabotaging the flagship's engines, the entire fleet would be free to ravage everything in their path. Ryder felt the weight of their responsibility, but the thought of failure was too much to bear. She couldn't let that happen. "We can't afford to be seen," Cole said, her voice low and steady as she outlined their infiltration plan. "The Deathworlders are vigilant, and their flagship is the most secure place in the fleet. We'll have to go in quiet, find the core controls, and disable the engines. If we can stop them from launching, we might buy enough time for the rest of the galaxy to act." The crew had trained for this kind of operation before, but this was different. They weren't just infiltrating an enemy ship. They were infiltrating the heart of a fleet that was desperate to survive, and that desperation meant they would be met with overwhelming resistance. Ryder couldn't afford to think of them as enemies, not yet. They were still humans, but they were also a force unlike anything she had encountered, and she knew their strength would make them nearly impossible to stop once they were aware of the crew's presence. The Seraphim dropped into the shadow of the flagship's massive hull, its dark silhouette blending into the vastness of space. The crew was suited up in full stealth gear, armed only with the bare essentials, ready for a mission that could either shift the fate of the galaxy or lead them to their end without anyone ever knowing they had existed. "Remember," Ryder said, her voice calm and clear as she looked each member of the team in the eye, "we do this quietly. We disable the engines and get out before they even know we're here." They moved with calculated precision. Each step was measured as they made their way into the depths of the flagship, through its docking bays and corridors, avoiding security checkpoints and guards with the agility of shadows. Every time they encountered a crew member from the Deathworlder fleet, they melted into the darkness, silent and unseen, their hearts pounding but their nerves steady. The ship was unlike anything Ryder had ever seen. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, polished design of the Seraphim. The Deathworlder fleet's flagship was made for function, not comfort. Every corner of it screamed of survival and practicality. Jagged metal surfaces and crude alloys gave the ship a brutal, almost primitive look, yet the technology it housed was far beyond anything they had encountered before. "We're close," Cole whispered as she led the team through a narrow maintenance shaft. "We've got about 5 minutes before the next patrol passes. We need to move quickly." "Understood," Ryder replied, her hand gripping her sidearm as she followed closely behind Cole, every instinct screaming to be ready for anything. The tension in the air was thick, every sound magnified. In the silence of the ship they could feel the weight of the Deathworlder's presence all around them, but they couldn't let it distract them from the mission ahead. As they reached the central control room, Ryder signaled for everyone to halt. They had found it. The heart of the ship's power systems, the engine cores, pulsating with a low hum that reverberated through the air. "We need to shut them down," Ryder said, her voice barely a whisper as she eyed the intricate control panels. Cole nodded, quickly moving to hack into the system. "This will take a few minutes, but once I'm in, we can shut down the engines." "Make it fast," Ryder warned. "The longer we're here, the higher the risk of being detected." They worked in perfect synchronization, the crew covering all angles, keeping watch while Cole worked her magic on the console. The minutes dragged by, each second feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, a harsh voice crackled over the intercom. Intruders detected in the lower levels. It was a cold, guttural tone, one that made Ryder's blood run cold. "We're compromised," Ryder muttered, "Get it done now." With a final press of the button, Cole's fingers flew across the console. "Engines are offline. We've got about 30 minutes before they figure out what happened." "Time to get out," Ryder snapped. "Move." The team sprinted through the halls, adrenaline pumping as the ship's alarm systems began blaring. The Deathworlders now fully aware of their presence, the mission wasn't over yet. They had to get off the ship before the entire fleet knew what had happened to them. But for the first time since landing, Ryder allowed herself to breathe just a little bit easier. They had disrupted the flagship's engines now. They had to make sure they didn't become another casualty in the fight for survival. The Seraphim's crew raced through the labyrinthine corridors of the Deathworlder flagship, their footsteps echoing against the cold industrial walls. The alarms blared overhead, signaling that their cover had been blown. The sounds of boots on metal grew louder. Closer, they had no more time to waste. Ryder led the charge, her heart pounding, each second dragging by with brutal weight. They had succeeded in their mission. The engines were offline, but getting back to the ship would be a fight for their lives. "We need to get to the docking bay, now," Ryder barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Cole, are we clear on the escape route?" "We're almost there," Cole said, her voice strained as she glanced at her wrist console. "But they're locking down all exits. The docking bay might be our only way out now." The team pushed forward, taking turns down sharp corners and through maintenance passages, their breathing ragged, their eyes sharp, every sense heightened. As they navigated through the enemy ship, each turn brought them closer to the docking bay, but also to the Deathworlder soldiers who were closing in. They finally reached the last corner before the docking bay, just a few hundred meters from their escape route. When everything went wrong, it happened in an instant. A sudden burst of static came through the comms, followed by a loud crackle of interference. Then, from behind them, a heavy, distorted voice shouted, "Captain Ryder." Ryder's heart dropped. She whirled around, her pulse spiking. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but the voice was unmistakable. Standing in the dim light of the corridor was a figure she never expected to see. Lieutenant Ethan Walters, a trusted officer and one of her closest allies on the Seraphim. His uniform was torn, his face bruised, but he was unmistakably alive and standing against them. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Ryder's voice was a mixture of shock and confusion. She had seen Walters as one of the most loyal officers on her crew, but now his presence here made no sense. "You shouldn't have come, Captain," Walters said, his voice flat, emotionless as he stepped forward slowly. "The Deathworlders have given me a new purpose, a new home." "Walters, you don't have to do this," Ryder said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We're trying to help them. This is madness. You can't side with them. These people, these survivors, they're just trying to live." But Walters didn't seem to hear her. His eyes were cold, distant, as if the man she had known no longer existed. "The galaxy has failed them, Captain," he said with an almost hollow tone, "and we're all just pawns in their game, too weak to survive in a world that demands strength. This is the future humanity deserves, a future of survival, no compromise." Ryder's chest tightened. She felt a sickening realization hit her all at once. Walters wasn't just a traitor. He had been swayed by the Deathworlders' worldview. He had joined them not out of malice, but because he believed in their cause. He had embraced their brutal philosophy, their fight for survival at all costs. "We're not pawns, Ethan," Ryder said, her voice shaking with frustration and sorrow. "We fight for something greater than that. We fight for hope, for the future of all humanity, not just for the strongest to survive." But Walters stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. "You don't understand, Captain," he said coldly. "This is the only way to ensure humanity's survival, by embracing the truth of what we really are." Before Ryder could respond, he raised his hand, signaling to the soldiers behind him who had emerged from the shadows. They were everywhere now, converging on them from all directions, blocking their path to the docking bay. The betrayal hit hard, sharper than any weapon. "Seize them," Walters commanded, and the soldiers surged forward. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The crew of the Seraphim was trapped. They had been betrayed by one of their own, someone who had once shared their mission, their purpose now. With no time left to question his motives, Ryder turned to her crew. "Fight through," she yelled, drawing her weapon as the soldiers closed in around them. "We don't give up." The team fought with everything they had, but the overwhelming numbers and Walter's cold betrayal weighed heavily on them. They had been so close to escaping, to saving the galaxy from a war. But now they were facing not only an enemy fleet, but the sting of being abandoned by one of their own. The battle raged on, and Ryder's mind raced with the question that now haunted her. If they couldn't trust each other anymore, could they ever truly win this war? The fight was chaotic. The crew of the Seraphim had no choice but to engage the Deathworlder soldiers, who surrounded them, their weapons flashing in the dim light of the corridor. But there was no winning this battle. Not with so many enemies closing in around them. Walter's betrayal had cut deeper than any blow they could have received from the enemy. His cold, calculating presence among the Deathworlders was a stark reminder that they were up against a force unlike anything they had prepared for. Ryder's mind raced, the adrenaline sharpening her focus despite the crushing despair that threatened to take over. She had trusted Walters, believed in his loyalty, and now he had turned against everything they stood for. The crew was outnumbered, but they weren't out of options, not yet. "Fall back," she shouted, pushing through the ranks of soldiers as she covered the crew's retreat. "We need to get to the docking bay now." The team fought with everything they had, their movements swift and practiced, but there was no avoiding the sheer number of Deathworlders on the flagship. The walls seemed to close in with every passing moment. Their only hope now was reaching the docking bay and securing their way off the ship before they were overwhelmed. "Captain," Cole's voice broke through the chaos. "There's too many of them. We can't keep this up." Ryder didn't respond. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder to find Walters, standing at the center of the group of Deathworlders, his cold eyes locked onto hers, the betrayal clear in his expression. But beneath that cold mask, she saw something else, a flicker of hesitation, of doubt. It was as if he was torn between his new allegiance and the years they had spent fighting together. "You don't have to do this, Ethan," Ryder shouted over the sounds of gunfire, her voice raw with emotion. "You don't have to choose this path. We can still stop this. We can still save everyone." Walter's eyes flickered, but then his face hardened once again. He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at her. "This is the way forward, Captain. You're too weak to see it." The words cut deep, but Ryder didn't have time to dwell on them. They had to move, and fast. With a final, reluctant glance at the man who had once been her closest ally, she turned and ran, pushing through the narrow corridors toward the docking bay. The sound of boots pounding against the metal floor echoed in the distance, but it wasn't enough to stop them. The Seraphim was their only chance now, and the closer they got to the docking bay, the more desperate the battle became. Soldiers pressed in on all sides, forcing the team into a fight for every step they took. "We're almost there," Cole yelled, her voice strained but filled with determination. "Just a little further." They reached the docking bay doors, and Ryder slammed her fist against the control panel, watching as the massive doors slowly began to open. The light from the Seraphim shone through, their only hope of escape. But just as they were about to rush through, a shot rang out, echoing in the cold space, and one of the crew members, Marcus, staggered back, blood pouring from his shoulder. He collapsed to the floor, but still managed to crawl toward the opening doors. "Go," he gasped. "Get out of here. Now." Ryder hesitated, her heart heavy with the weight of his sacrifice. But she knew she couldn't leave him behind. "Not like this, Marcus," she shouted, but the sound of approaching soldiers forced her to make the hardest decision of her life. "We can't stay." Cole pulled Ryder back. "We can't save him, Captain. We have to go." The decision tore through her, but she knew it was true. They had no choice. No time to mourn as Marcus fought for his life. The rest of the team piled into the Seraphim, and the hatch slammed shut behind them. The doors sealed, and the ship's engines roared to life. "Engines online," Cole reported, her voice strained as she glanced back at the docking bay. We're away. As the Seraphim shot into space, Ryder's thoughts were heavy with regret, guilt, and loss. They had failed, but they had survived, at least for now. The Seraphim broke through the flagship's defense perimeter, escaping into the cold expanse of space, the Deathworlder's fleet now drifting behind them, stalled and powerless without the flagship's engines. But the battle wasn't over, and Ryder knew it. This was just the beginning of a war she had never imagined. The galaxy was fractured, teetering on the edge of destruction, and they were now the only ones who knew the truth, that the Deathworlders weren't just invaders, they were survivors just like anyone else. They didn't want to conquer, they wanted to live, even if it meant pushing everything else aside to do so. And as the Seraphim's crew set their course toward the unknown, Ryder swore to herself that they would find a way to stop the conflict before it was too late, to make sure that this fight for survival didn't destroy everything they had fought so hard to protect.